Guys in jackets in August. We should be wearing like Hawaiian shirts or something. I'm joined for the next hour by Dr. Jasper Fessmann. He is an academic professor at West Virginia University. He is also one of the, and I guess this is still for now, fairly few folks whose focus of their research and of their academic career is on the field that we all work in, the field of communications for good. So he studies the work that's happening at foundations and nonprofits. We're having this conversation with him because the network this year, Communications Network, is turning 40 years old, and we thought, while we've been spending a lot of time thinking about ways to be useful to our friends and colleagues about things that might be emerging in the future, perhaps you've had a chance to see the series we've been doing in the Chronicle of Philanthropy called Looking Ahead, the Future of Communications for Good. You've seen pieces maybe by Cecile Richards, by Anne-Marie Slaughter, Andy Purness, Travian Shorters, Lisa Witter, lots of other great folks. Most recently, Priya Parker, talking about the art of gathering, a strategic purpose there. While we've been looking ahead, we also know that it's really important to know where we came from. And I think for a lot of us, the network has experienced extraordinary growth over the last several years, and a lot of folks perhaps aren't familiar with our story, or even more broadly, the story of the field. And so Jasper is going to help us over the next little while. We'll take your questions. We're going to learn a little bit about where we came from, what's sort of the origin story. So maybe, if you don't mind too terribly, we could start right there with there was an ancient version of this story, then there's a more modern version of the story of the history of the field of communications for good. And Jasper occasionally calls it public interest communications. I'll try to nick him on the knee or something when he does it, but he's talking about the exact same thing, communications for good, the work that you do, serving at foundations and nonprofits or at the agencies that work with them. So Jasper, if you would, give us sort of the quick version of like a long history, going back to Plato and Socrates, and then bringing us into the modern era.
Sure. I think, looking at it historically as a concept, just the power of using communications to advance social issues or to really change society really goes back to the ancient Greek, especially ancient Athens. I would say since they were the first democracy, and I would say in a democracy you really have the power of the individual to influence society, and the core way to do this is communications. So even in the Athenian democracy, people knew that rhetoric and persuasive communication was a way to really rise and influence how the society worked and was. So we actually have the first trained, the first teachers of communication, or overall, in the ancient Greek world, the so-called sophists. And they were pretty much like PR professionals to some degree today. They were paid to train people how to be good communicators. Part of the problem there was that they did work for anybody who paid for it.
I was going to say, in my family, my father used to always offer it up as an insult. He'd say, "That's sophistry," whenever he was angry with one of us.
So I would say, but I think that's the fundamental tension is it a skill set where everybody, you just buy it basically, and if you're good at it, or has a different meaning? Is it a mindset? Does it matter how you use it? And I think that's where Socrates and Plato came in. Socrates very clearly said, the sophists, they just make money, that's not what communication should be about. I mean, for him it was more philosophy, but it really is something we should use that power that we have only for good purpose. We're looking for the good world, and make the world a better place. I think if you look at the Republic, Plato is very clearly, this is how the society could work better, how we have a much better society. And that has been a strain going throughout the history. I don't think it really public interest communication or communication for good was not always there, because if we have a closed-minded society, I think then after the Roman Republic, there's a lot of times that there was not really communication along those lines. So I think the concept has been around. It has played a role for Thomas Paine to write Common Sense throughout history. But I don't think we can really call it public interest communication or communication for good until really the 1970s or 80s, when we have a modern sense, when it really became an integral function of what organizations did.
Right, and even actually there was a precedent, right? Because we talked about this before the camera went live, which is in the 1950s and the 1960s, perhaps the first model of communications for good in the modern era, post-World War II era, would be the civil rights movement in the United States. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the civil rights movement is in many ways a pivotal case that showed how much power there was in organizing and really developing a social movement, but it didn't emerge out of a vacuum either. I mean, there have been some social campaigns beforehand. For example, the Am I Not a Man and Brother campaign in the 19th century, really to end slavery, played a big role in showing that you could use some of those communications. But the civil rights movement really is the example that shows up in every literature because it so clearly showed how to have that impact, and communication was core to it. Martin Luther King was really clear about that public relations for him. He said it was the important skill that he needed to really get the message across. He was very good at it. He had conceptual foundations, more like Gandhi. He was inspired by Gandhi and nonviolence, ahimsa. But it also was a very strategic act of Joan Robinson to plan the Montgomery bus boycott and really wait for the right person to emerge.
This is Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, yes. Rosa Parks would have been an activist on her own right, and she was very conscious of going in there, but she wanted to set a legal precedent. And Joan Robinson, who was the head of the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, had been planning for a bus boycott for almost 2 years, had done some of the research and really waited for the right person to be arrested to launch a major campaign. And the community was very strongly against it at the time. She launched it, and that really became the core trigger for the civil rights movement in my understanding. And I think everybody else has seen ever since, both in political science and in communications, as a role model for everything happened afterwards as the civil rights movement.
It's probably a good time to explain to everybody.
Yes.
You may have picked this up from the accent, but Jasper is not from here. You grew up in
Germany.
So you had a moment in your own life in which communications played a massive role, the witnessing of the Berlin Wall coming down. You want to speak to that a little bit, and then we'll get back on track?
Sure.
It might be helpful for people to know a little bit about your background.
So for me, one of the core things that motivates me, even 30 years later, is really, I grew up in an environment where the world could end next week. The Cold War was very imminent. In Berlin, you knew you were at ground zero for anything that would happen, and if somebody made a mistake, the world could literally end and we all die. Humanity is gone. It's fortunate that most people don't have that mindset anymore, but it really has impressed on me how important the decisions we make can really have on this. Then I grew up in an environment that thought that the Cold War would never end and Germany could never be reunited. For me, that was like talking about reunification is bringing the gold standard back, or the South will rise again. From the level of abstraction, I don't know if the South is a good example, but I'm saying it's just complete with crazy talk. More right-wing crazy talk. And then suddenly, in a very short span, in the span of 3 months, the world completely changed. And even the fall of the Berlin Wall was a pure accident because a mistake of a communication professional on the other side. The East German press secretary, I mean, there was a lot of energy going on, the world was changing, but East Germany was completely resisting that. And they could have gone the same way as China did, trying to suppress and keep their government working. So they decided they're allowing a small concession of allowing East Germans to travel, but what they intended to do is if you traveled, your family stayed back and would end up in jail if you actually left. So basically your family were held hostage. Fortunately for all of us, the East German press secretary, Günter Schabowski, was not part of the meeting. He was handed a press release with no further briefing. He went into the briefing and read out the press release which said East Germans are allowed to travel. So an Italian journalist asked the obvious question, when does it take effect? I'm very happy that Günter Schabowski was not well trained in communications, because if he would have been well trained, he would have not speculated. Instead, he looked down on it, it said immediate release, so he says, I don't know, effective immediately. That was a central mistake on his part, and for us a glorious moment, because people saw it on the news and they went to the border and said, hey, we saw it on the news, let us out. The border guards had no orders, nothing. They saw it on the TV too. Nobody could be reached in higher authority. They were all in the theater. And first there were a couple people, then there were hundreds, and then there were thousands of people at the border with a legitimate claim to say, hey, we're allowed to travel. And the Eastern border guards just didn't know what to do. They let them out. The interesting thing for me is I actually watched it on TV, told my parents about they're allowed to travel, and went to bed that night. I couldn't imagine that.
How old were you at this time?
16 or 17. So I was very aware of it, but it was one of those, it didn't change. I missed most of that night. The next morning, the world had completely changed. I went to school actually, again, hadn't realized how much had changed. And our professor said, or teacher said, I was there when the Berlin Wall was built. I can't do school today. So we organized, my class said, okay, let's go there. He said, yes. So we went to our director, who basically said, no, you're going to do regular class. At that point, we organized for the first time in my life. We spread out and mobilized the rest of the school. And after about an hour and hundreds of students outside his office, our director basically said, you know what, just go. But we didn't go directly to the Brandenburg Gate. We spread out and stormed several other schools. And at the end of it, we were 5,000 to 7,000 students walking down the Kurfürstendamm, which is the main highway in Berlin, to the Brandenburg Gate. There were a couple of schools that literally barred the doors and padlocked the doors. They missed the entire event.
To keep the students in.
To keep the students in. They had been warned. But most of the students came with us, and we ended up really at the Brandenburg Gate. Whenever you see the pictures with the crowd, it's up there. I was one of them. I'm on the right corner. Sometimes I know exactly where I am. I have seen friends. I can show you where I was at that time. The interesting thing, what you don't see in the picture, is that there were still East German border guards on the other side. They were literally, the wall is about at that point about as wide as this room, and you sit on the other side and there were border guards, but the atmosphere had completely changed. 24 hours before, they would have shot you for where you were, and it was very clear the government had no control whatsoever anymore. If they would have tried to impose their control, they would have ended up against the wall. So, like Ceausescu did. Wow. So it really had changed in one night. Everything had changed.
And communications, you believe, played a central role?
The central role was communications, and for me, that was the wake-up moment. First of all, to this day, nobody can tell me we have to accept the world we live in. Just because it has been like this for 50 years, that's not an argument that works for me, because I know we can change it. It's hard, but the world has changed several times in my life in a fundamental way, so why not change it for the better?
Fair enough. Okay, so let's jump back. And
Yes,
before we do that, I should let everybody know we will be taking your questions along the way, so just type them in if you're on Facebook or Instagram. We're monitoring there. Also, our friend Yabby, as she always does, is live tweeting this on our Twitter handle, which is @theComNetwork. And so if you use the hashtag ComNetLive, that's COMNETLIVE, we'll be keeping an eye on your questions and we'll take them that way as well. All right, so let's move into the modern era of communications for good as we know it. It's 1979. David Fenton's going to arrive on the scene in a minute. It's 1979, Frank Corral. What happens?
I think almost, 2/3 or more of the people that I've interviewed and talked about really come through David Fenton, and he was really the visionary of the field. He was originally a science reporter, which I think is important.
This is Frank we're talking
Frank Corral, yes.
Oh, sorry, it said David Fenton. So just to clarify, you mean Frank Corral?
Frank Corral. Frank Corral was first a science reporter, and I think that's critical because he really understood science. And one of the core difference of modern public interest communication or communication for change is really, or for the good, is really that we work research-based. That we do make sure that the approach we're advocating is really scientifically based and not just our opinion. And I think that's a core point to justify what we do, is to really say that's what the science tells us what we do. If we look at some of the areas in climate change, you can make very clear, we can talk about this later, the science is absolutely clear, climate change is happening, it's a major threat, we have to do something about it. But there's a lot of people who work against it, a lot of them knowing that the data is differently. So I think Frank Corral had really the vision, and he built a network of people, just convinced them communication is really important. When he started, communication was very much a subservient function in management. You did it support, you did the press release, you did the brochure.
If it existed at all, right? It wasn't true
Right.
every foundation or nonprofit had a comms function.
That's very much true on the professional side for PR as well at the time. A lot of times it was you did advertising, marketing, those kind of things. And communication was one of the support function, I would say, staff support function. And I think Frank really was good in grabbing other people at the senior level that understood that their role, in order to really have an impact on an issue, you needed to communicate it well. What I've noticed, and people in the interview said, often enough, the founding people or the core people tend to be experts on the subject matter, be it poverty, be it housing, be it whatever it is, but they're often not formally trained communicators, and you might have the best message out there, best mission, but if you can't get it across, nobody else to convince, then it doesn't help you much. And I think Frank Corral and other people around him started to just exchange ideas, get together. From what I've understood about the company in the early days, it was more or less Frank Corral and friends, just on a higher level, sitting together and say, I'm at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, you're at the Ford Foundation, what are your challenges? And we all together need to fight for our role. In PR, it's called the management function of public relations. The core notion to do the job right, you need to be really involved in the decision-making process. And I think that's what the driving force to say, hey, we have to really move it. And it originally happened at the senior agencies, not agencies, the senior foundations. They had the money, they had the broad vision to really say, okay, we need communications. And from there, it became a larger network. From what I understand, Frank Corral stepped back and let other people grow it after it grew to 20 people or so. And from there, it has developed further and really built the foundations of the field.
So Frank, 1979, gets together with some colleagues. It's very informal at that time, but in many ways, quite pressing to build a network. This idea that there was a chance to learn from peers, there was knowledge out there, there was experience and expertise that could be quite useful to you, but not much infrastructure. The network as a nonprofit organization, the place that we work today, and that serves the field, didn't really exist. It really was that sort of personal or private network. But then there was that next sort of inflection point for folks who, including me, I didn't know a lot of this history. Karen Maselli and Ruth Shack, and maybe some of the other names that you referred to in the past as the people who sort of took Frank's work and built it further. Andy Burness, another example there.
Right, I would say, I mean, there's a little bit of a parallel development. I think the other person who played a major role was David Fenton, who basically said he understood PR really well, and he wanted to do public relations for good. So he started an agency, and I think that played a big role in some of the others. A, that you can really have a field, that you can make a go of doing actually having an agency and making money at the same time, that you can support the work, and that played a big role. And a lot of the people that I interviewed had worked at Fenton. So I would say a third came through the network and Frank Corral, and two thirds came through the Frank network, and about a third came through David Fenton. And
so this is all within a fairly narrow time base.
Right.
This is 1979, the Communications Network begins. 1982, David Fenton opens Fenton Communications. What was happening in the, beyond what we might know, there was the election of 1980, you got the Iran hostage crisis here in the United States, but what was in the water that was creating this movement among folks in the philanthropy space, and in David's case, building something that heretofore really not existed, a private agency dedicated to doing communications for good? What happened? What do you think were some of the contributing factors?
I would say one of the interesting things from my perspective, since I'm more a PR scholar and I know the history of public relations very well, the PR industry was undergoing the same change at the same time, pretty much. For the field, the core defining book is basically Grunig and Hunt, 1986. That's what a lot of the theory, the excellence theory, really put a backbone into the PR.
I'm sorry, the name of the book again is?
Grunig and Hunt. David Grunig at Maryland, and it was an edited volume. Some of the key people were in part of that book, but that has really made it major.
And the name of the book was, also the author is David Grunig, but the name of the book, do you remember?
Not right now. I've quoted it several times. I know the citation's usually pretty at heart, but not right now.
Gotcha. We can post it up online, and your dissertation, which includes a lot of this,
yes,
is also available online. So if folks Google you, so if you Google Jasper Fessmann, right?
Yes.
Then your dissertation will pop up, and a lot of this information is actually one of the wonderful things about that piece is it's academic. I found my way through it, right? It's not that tough of a slog if I can manage it, but it also includes sort of a narrative that explains sort of the journey that this field has been on.
But there are also some academic journals and articles that are a little bit easy to read too that summarize some of that. But yes, you can find it on ResearchGate or academia.com.
But I'm sorry, so that book, what were some of the big sort of themes or trends that were emerging in the late 70s?
The core, for PR, the core theoretical framework that still is one of the driving force today is called excellence theory. The core notion to basically say to do excellent public relations, we have to do certain things, and we have to have a management. It have to be part of the decision-making process, not just the supplemental. So that's why I see the parallel. So in the PR industry has ever since had that backbone and say, we need to be at the table, we need to be in the decision-making. If you close a factory somewhere, it might, accounting say we save $200,000, but from a PR standpoint, that's going to be an absolutely nightmare and will drive the stock market down.
Right, or if you happen to work for the government of East Germany and you're not in the room, guess what happens?
Exactly. But back to, I think, back to Frank Corral, I think he just realized to do the job right, he understood communication well enough to really say, to be effective, we need to be part of it. We need to be there and be part of the entire decision-making process. The message strategy has to be integral to the overall mission of the organization. If you don't have the right message, it doesn't matter what else you do. And I think that's from that kind of thinking, the rest grew and people started to really see it. And from what I've read and from some of the interviews and discussed, on the foundation side, they realized that the organizations that used communications were successful, or the project that really integrated communication were successful where the other ones were not. And so from the leadership, I would say they just realized this is working and we need to do more communication in order to be successful.
Yeah, I always say, and it's not a novel idea, that foundations and nonprofits fundamentally are in the ideas business.
Right.
That idea could be we want to eradicate disease, or it could be we want to halt the advance of climate change, or we want to support and lift up the arts. Big, noble, grand ideas, but they, for the most part, live inside the four walls where they're born. And in order for those ideas to go out into the wider world and have an impact, in order to shift the national conversations, in order to build movements, and in order to build will to make these ideas realized, or to realize these ideas, that's a communications function. Taking those ideas out into the wider world in a way that's going to be smart, strategic, and effective is a communications function. And I think that our field has been on a journey, our sector has been on a journey to understand that over the last 40 years. We've seen some real success. 4 phases, though, of the network's history. So phase 1 was Frank Corral and a small group of colleagues gathering, for the most part, privately, in an era of, by the way, long-distance phone calls, right, and fax machines, and so communications quite a bit different. Then that next phase was, as the network reached a sort of critical mass, 20, 30 people,
right.
Frank starts to step back a little bit and hands over the network, gives the work back to folks like Karen Maselli, Ruth Shack, Andy Burness, and other folks. And then what happens? Because that's a pivotal point as well. It goes from one to many, and what happens there?
And I think then later on it started to grow more and more, but it was still, the people that ran it were people that did it on the side. They had full-time jobs, and the third major step was then when it really became professionalized. And you can talk more than I about this, is when the stage became, when your job basically started to be created. And
right. Yeah, the network didn't become a 501c3, if I'm not mistaken, until the mid-90s, I believe. Mid to late 90s was when the network moved from being first almost a private network of professionals to an organization, an affinity group that was managed or associated with the council and foundations, which is an entity that represents lots of foundations here in Washington, D.C. And then at some point it reached a critical mass, and there was enough of a will among, particularly at that point, foundations, because the network was exclusively the province of philanthropy until 2012. So at that point, they created a 501c3 and they hired a staff. And then, what happens? The network becomes a professional organization. Then what happens?
I think it just started to really spread out. Because a lot of the smaller organizations and foundations didn't have the staff already understanding. So from the top down, it was a lot top-down spread of capacity building. I think a couple of the people that really were involved in it also on the agency side, really it's about capacity building. That all the smaller foundations at that point really started to understand we have to be involved in this too. Communication is relevant for our work. If the big dogs, to use a very colloquial, doing that and really successful, we have to, that is something to it. And I think it really started to spread out very strongly there, and more foundations got involved, and it became a matter of if you want to be professional, you understood that you needed to be involved. And I think that in the 2012, was the third stage, and then people realized that, we're only having half of the field right now. With only the foundation side, but the nonprofits were not really part of the communications network at that point, and there was a conscious decision made to really reach out and broaden the field to include nonprofits. I think at that point also more the senior nonprofits, like Red Cross or something along those lines, and bring them on board.
Yeah, it was the national communications focused nonprofits. At least it started and has really remained that way for the last few years, but we have seen explosive growth folks in the network now, coming from both philanthropy and the nonprofit side. And
I would say that actually, well, again, I think Frank Corral was still the driving force in the background. Most people, basically anybody I interviewed at some point said Frank was the inspiration. I met Frank, and that's how for them communication for good began. They were working in the field somewhat, but Frank played a critical role to really bring everybody together. But I also think that towards the end of his life, he really had that vision that was driving it for the 30, 40 years before, and then decided to really put that into the academic side too. So he endowed, I don't know how many people know this, but one of the last things he did is he endowed the Frank and Betsy Corral Chair of Public Interest Communication at the University of Florida, which was his alma mater, to really build an academic side and really build a community along those lines.
So while the organization, the network, is 40 years old, the field is not much older in the modern sense that we understand it. It really feels like then, from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of room yet to run. There's a lot yet to be learned. There's a lot more to be done by the people who are part of the organization, part of this field today.
I agree. I think we're still very much at the beginning. I mean, we can properly talk about the field. In some of my research, I really would say in the last 5 or 10 years, it really starts to have a sense of self-identity that wasn't really before then. And I think that people see, this is what I can do, and that's why I'm in here, and it becomes a lot more grassroots too. At University of Florida, the Frank Conference really led people to get the energy of like, I know why I'm doing this. I'm now self-identifying as public interest communication. That's where people say more public interest communication. Here it's more communication for good. And that really took off then. And the second network that really sprung up at Frank 17 is the Radicals Communications Network. Chanel Macias has really built a network.
So Chanel was the communications director for Black Lives Matter.
Yes. And she got together with a couple of people at Frank 17, and they basically said we needed it was a mailing list originally. It has developed more in a network, and it has about 800 people in there. And I think it's really interesting how grassroots it is. It's very much like, hey, I need help on that job. Can anybody help me write a press release or something? Or there's a job here in San Francisco. Here's a meeting, something along those lines. But I found also interesting that some of the change is happening there. For example, somebody found in public available records that Ogilvy was doing.
This is Ogilvy Public Relations,
Yes.
the firm. Okay.
One of the largest, largest 3 agencies worldwide, was actually doing PR work, getting $5 million for 4 months of work, or the other way around, $4 million for 5 months of work for the border security department. And it was posted there, and then people took it and used their press contacts to really say, hey, this is happening, this is not what should be happening. Most of the people in the agency had no clue either. A lot of the employees started to, hey, that's not who we are, and the major conversation started basically somebody going through finance records. So I think that's quite interesting.
So we have time for questions,
Yes.
and I gather we have a few. Stacy, you want to give us a few?
We have one. There was one, I believe, was the clarification of the book. They were asking, is it the 4 models of public relations?
No.
Okay.
That's not the venture book.
That's a simple, that again is something Brunig brought up in different sides where you look at different stages, but it's not. And it's getting too complicated to bring here. It has little to do with what we do here in public interest communications.
We've just had a lot of people are loving the stories and they're loving ComNet, but not too many more questions.
Okay, we'll bring the questions and we'll keep going if you want us. Let's talk a little bit about, maybe just based on that question, this idea of a skill set versus a mindset. Because I think this is one of the things you and I talked a little bit offline, but one of the things that distinguishes communications from good than what we might think of as traditionally corporate PR, which has a long, rich history, is that there is a mindset within communications for good, and this is where we get to talk a little bit about deep time or timescale.
One of the things I must say, what I found interesting, there's a debate going on in the interviews, 2 opinions, is public interest communication or communication for good just a neutral skill set? Does
and by neutral skill set, you mean you're a good writer, you're able to...
Right, is it, and does every organization have the right, is my public interest communication, if I work to advocate anti-vaccination, is that public interest communication? Or is it a mindset that is integral to, you do public interest communication because you have progressive values? I mean, one of the things that really comes out as public interest communication for a lot of people is you do this because you have progressive values. And I agree with this in the sense that I think public interest communication has this very similar skill set to public relations or other corporate communications. How to write a press release is the same for, for a foundation. How to write it, what inverted pyramid, those kind of things. But why you do it and how you do it is different in the sense of you. Among other things, one of the core differences is in PR, a normal campaign is about 6 months. In public interest communication, to make an impact, it takes 10 to 30 years. You're working on a much larger time scale, and you have to think very differently about what you do. I would also say that, in some sense, public interest or making social change is a lot harder than public relations.
I was going to say the ask is totally different, right?
Yes, the ask, often enough in public relations, the ask is choose my brand of soda versus the other one. In public interest communication, or
Communications for good.
Communication for good, it is about stop drinking soda. That means completely changing your lifestyle. That is really, really difficult to achieve. We know that sugar is really one of the core driving factors of obesity, and we all should stop drinking sugary drinks. But I'm guilty every often enough to drink, knowing this full well. I can't resist a Coke when I go to a restaurant or somewhere on the way. So I think that's one of the core difference at long time scale. We have to think a lot more strategic. Yeah.
And so just a question there. I think, is that a widely held belief or understanding, particularly at the management level or at the board level, that when you're investing in communications, if I'm understanding you correctly, in order to do this work well, the time scale that you're operating in necessarily has to say, we're creating strategic communications plans that could be 10, 20, 5, 15 years long. Almost never will we tether our work to a time scale of 6 months, 3 months, a year, maybe 18 months.
I don't think that most people recognize it. I must say,
why is that? Why is that a challenge for people?
Because I don't think it has been even talked about. I must say, for me, that was actually one of the key insights for me from doing my research. When I talked to Kristen Grimm, she said this.
Kristen Grimm runs Spitfire Strategies and has been active in the network
Right.
and at the University of Florida and elsewhere, has been a real pioneer over the last 20-some years. I don't want to date her for quite a while.
I would like to really say, to go a little bit on the sideline, just to give a bit of overview of the field. On the agency side, there's 3 major agencies: Fenton Communications, Barnes Communications, and Spitfire. You have a couple of
Lots of other wonderful agencies too,
Right.
to be fair, but as far as rich history of this field, they were in many ways trailblazers
Right.
or pioneers. Okay.
And also, I mean, those are the 3 large ones. You have a couple of medium to boutique agencies that are out there to do great work. But from a PR standpoint, from a ranking, those are the only 3. They have about 50 people, full-time staff, and several offices. If you look at that, there's only 3 major ones, but the smaller ones do great, fantastic.
I cut you off on your
Yes.
train of thought, sorry.
Anyway, the core, I think people haven't recognized that the long-term game is what you need to do. For me, there was an aha moment. I had not thought along those times either, along those lines, until Kristen mentioned it, and I was like, yes, it's obvious. It should have always been part, but I hadn't thought along those lines either at that point. So I think we just have to make them aware that that's one of the core challenges they're facing.
And so that also speaks to the idea that strategic thinking and strategy are so critically important to being successful in this work.
Right.
Obviously, you have to get buy-in, you need a seat at the
Sure.
table, but you need to bring a mindset that whatever your challenge may be, whatever the ambition that your organization is trying to move forward, ain't going to get solved in a week. It's not going to happen in a month. And one of the things we talked about, there's wonderful examples out there. Civil rights, obviously, being one where our country's still on a journey. But marriage equality is another. I think for a lot of people, there's a belief that, well, we went from the defeat of California's Proposition 8 to, in very short order, just a couple of years, to Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, and Washington State passing or making it legal for gay couples to marry. And then shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court. So for many people, that timescale feels really narrow. And yet, you and I talked about this a little bit off camera, it actually goes all the way back to Stonewall.
Right.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
I would say, I mean, I think the Proposition 9 is one of the interesting things because it actually was the biggest failure. Robert Perez, I interviewed for my dissertation too, and they said that it was really, because they completely failed with the Proposition 9, that's when they really realized, oh, we have to do communications. There had been movement building for a long time. They thought in California they would pass. It was not just that that the electorate was against them in general. At the same election, they passed a law which basically forbade chicken to be in cages in California. So the progressive energy was there, but it didn't help them for marriage equality. So they realized we need a much longer plan.
And Barack Obama was elected president in 2008
Yes.
as well. So chickens got rights.
Yes.
Barack Obama gets elected president, and in the state of California, Proposition 8 failed. It's a bit of a surprise there.
But that was, from what I understand, the critical moment when they understood they need long-term planning. They have to say a 20-year plan. They developed a 20-year plan, how many states they wanted to be on the ballot in the next 5 years, in 10 years, and that really drove the whole conversation. So they became strategic communication because they failed. And yes, Stonewall or in Miami, those were core moments that built the movement for a long time. And some of the traces go back, I would say, even in the 50s, where there were some activists in hiding, most of them. But yes,
So much longer time scale that I think most of us recognize. One example of a campaign that has lived within this sort of geologic, or at least human scale, geologic time scale, deep time, is the Truth Initiative.
Right.
Campaign. Want to talk about that a little bit? They won the Jones Award, by the way, last year. So we are mindful of a little bit of their work, but maybe you could just help for folks who may not have their brains oriented around what truth is or what they did just now.
Well, since I know you interviewed Eric Ashe, I think you're better qualified to talk about some of the things that they're really thankful. From my perspective, the interesting thing, if you look at tobacco, tobacco played a critical role in forming the world that we live in today. They were the first to realize that in order to protect their business model, they had to attack science. Naomi Oreskes really pointed out at Harvard.
Name again?
Naomi Oreskes is the eminent historian of science at Harvard University, and she did a wonderful book and movie called Merchants of Doubt, which really chronicles how the tobacco industry developed the core skill set to really defeat science by attacking the science itself. So the PR, and from my perspective, the PR people involved there, especially Hill and Norton, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew how to be very strategic in communications. I think a misunderstanding, to go a little bit on a sidetrack, what is strategic communications for me? We talk about strategic communications all the time, but often enough it's misunderstood. For me, and it's really clear, the term comes from the ancient Greek again.
Oh, thank you. I could say the same thing all the time. Office and command of a general is where the word strategy comes
yes.
from.
It's a war-winning strategy. It's not about the individual, and that's requires a completely different skill set than being on a tactical level. For example, George Washington was a brilliant strategist, but a horrible field commander, actually. He lost basically every battle that he
I was going to say, if you've seen Hamilton, you know what we're talking about.
But he kept the strategic mission was to keep the army alive and keep it long enough that the momentum would be going. But he basically lost, except Yorktown, he lost every battle. On the other hand, Benedict Arnold was probably the best field commander, but became the core traitor of the...
Somehow this conversation has moved to Benedict Arnold.
But I mean, historically speaking, he played a critical role at Saratoga to turn around the battle, and that basically was critical. It's ironic how some of the dynamics work. I'm just using George Washington because strategically he was brilliant, tactically he was not. And it's a different skill set in the military to be on a strategic level. And the same is true in communication. You need a long-term plan how to really make an impact, and then that can drive you tactical. But as Sun Tzu said, if you just have the tactical level, basically, you will lose every half hour, every second battle. But if you just have tactics, that's the noise before defeat. So strategy is really what you need, and but strategy is hard. Mm-hmm. The core point, it's much easier to write a press release or go through the same motions than really come up with something innovative way to win a war. And I think often enough, on the other side, we have well-trained strategists to work for vested interests. They have the money to hire people that have been professional.
Okay, so we're getting to an interesting place. Are there questions now?
Oh,
let's take a couple of questions,
sure.
But then let's come back, just put a pin in this idea of who are you up against?
Yes.
Because I think that's definitely worth folks knowing. We aren't doing this in a vacuum.
So we have a question from Mandy Flores with it, and she says, recently our foundation released a statement rejecting Trump's hateful language.
This is the Kenneth Rainin Foundation.
Directed at 4 congressmen. We received some feedback saying that speaking out in this way is not core to our mission. We obviously disagree. What are your thoughts?
Should foundations speak up around issues that may not be core to their stated mission, but may run afoul of their core values?
I would say yes, because I think in the current environment where facts don't matter anymore, we have to speak up. We have a social responsibility, all of us, to just not allow people to lie. The simple fact is Trump lies every day. Other people lie routinely. It used to matter, and we feel like it's not mattering anymore. And part of why it doesn't feel it's mattering anymore, because often enough we should just shrug it off nowadays. I think they should. Every organization that values truth and values their mission, they should speak up.
Yeah, Mandy, I just, speaking completely personally, not in my professional role, thank you for what you and the folks, Jennifer Rain and the folks at the Kenneth R. Rainin Foundation did in speaking out. I think a piece of, if you were asking me, a piece of all of our work, if you work in the social sector, if you work at a foundation, or you work at a nonprofit, a piece of our responsibility is to do good and to bring good into the world and to provide some guidelines and boundaries, maintain some boundaries for people within society. I think it's always helpful to to remind people that there are folks who are seeking out a better future. They're interested in perfecting the American project. And so when you speak up and speak out on behalf of your values, I think you are always aligned with your core purpose, which is bringing good into the world. So very, very grateful for the work you've done, and many others in the sector over the last few weeks have been stepping forward. So grateful for that. Other questions we might have?
Janie Ferguson Skirty, she's a little eager and she wants to know, what are the trends we should anticipate?
The trends. Well, first of all, I hope you've been reading the series in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, but let's put it to you. You have a chance to sit outside of the sector as a practitioner, as an academic. What are some of the trends that you see emerging?
I mean, one of the core trends, obviously, but that's true in communication overall, is how technology impacts the field. I think on the one side, you really have enormous power that has emerged. The democratization of the social media, it allows everybody with a cell phone to really have a social impact in a way that 20 years ago was absolutely unthinkable. It has the drawback that it allows kooks and nutcases to get their points out and find other nutcases. And it makes it really hard to distinguish some of the fake news from the real, but it also has enormous power and level the playing field. If you have a video and data and something to really show, you can impact society in a fundamental way. And I would say, for example, for me, the Me Too movement really has something to do with technology. Nowadays, they feel free enough that they can go out. In a way, I think 20 years ago, Me Too was not really possible in the sense that it's worked today. I think that's technology.
And networks, right? I mean,
Yeah,
technology
yes.
is enabling these networks to suddenly connect.
Right.
I mean, ultimately, the technology is the tactic that's allowing people to find one another.
Right.
There's a fellow named Alfred Ironside. He's probably known to many of you. He was the former chair of the network and vice president of communications at the Ford Foundation. And he's thought about this. One of the ways that he describes it, I think it's quite compelling, is that we're in an era of disruption and change. Obviously, I think we all know that. But then one of the ways that he describes this moment is that we're moving from mass to many.
Right.
And by that he means mass broadcast, and whether that's through the media, that could look like everybody tuning into Walter Cronkite, as many of us of a certain age did in the 70s and the 80s. Or
You probably have to explain who Walter Cronkite is.
Walter Cronkite, yeah, you're right. For at least some of you folks, he was a television anchor on CBS Evening News in the 70s, even in the 60s, I think, up to the 80s when I think he retired. But television is still the primary way that Americans get their news and information. No judgments there, but increasingly that is becoming fractured, that where in the past it was appointment viewing to sit down with the evening news or to pick up the New York Times or to tune into All Things Considered on NPR, any number of the fairly narrow band of mass broadcast media that was available. It's now much more likely that people will report back that they get their information from a friend, a colleague, maybe not somebody who lives next door, somebody who shared something with them on Facebook, or something that they saw from somebody that they follow on Twitter, or they themselves may be actually generating information and putting it out into the world. So that mass to many is this moment that we're in, and I think it's a moment of transition, and certainly a trend that we're all still grappling with. How do we capture, or how do we do our work effectively in a moment of this kind of transition?
I think one of that is also what people really have to grapple with is what's called the content shockwave. Because, I mean, to give you an example, in 1979, when the network was founded, there were about 400,000 news stories a year.
400,000.
400,000 for the entire U.S.
Okay.
That's the same amount of news stories are generated in 2 days nowadays. So you have, and it's accelerating, it continues to accelerate. So that also means that in news, you can't talk about the evening news. I mean, when I grew up, and you probably had the same experience, I could talk to all my friends. They had watched the exact same news story as I had. The chances now, if I would ask my students, if I have 100 students, I would say probably 5 would have the same, watch the same show at the same time, and that has completely changed. And something that really makes it difficult to get through the clutter, I would say, with the core messages. That's a second point. One of the core points I would also say that is changing or needs to be changing is being aware that often enough you're facing on a social issue what I call a communications war. Often enough, vested interests really approach communication from a winner-takes-all, war, everything is allowed in a war kind of approach, and they have the money to really be effective in this.
Oh, we're going to go here.
Okay.
We're going to go here. Okay. So, brought a little problem. This book is either just about to be published or just
No,
came out. It's out.
No.
Okay. So Jasper edited this. This is Strategic Climate Change Communications. Do you want to give him the headline? This is the thing. I went home. He told me this. I went home and told my wife. And I have a feeling when you hear this, this is going to be part of your dinner table conversation as well. When it comes to climate change, do you want to just set the table? What's the dynamic? What's the field look like right now?
I would say the core point is climate change and climate change communication is really interesting because in no other field the problems of fake news and attack on science have been as strong and as dynamic and as successful everywhere. I mean, it's really the case that the amount of money, for example, that's in
this is
climate
the war. This is the war example.
The war example, yes. So climate denial organizations really approach it from we attack the science in order to stop change. The core purpose is to maintain the status quo, make sure that nothing happens in society on climate change. And they have been doing this for 40 years, basically. It really has been successful. Interestingly enough, ExxonMobil were actually the first ones whose data told them there is a problem, climate change is happening. At that point, Exxon had to make a choice in some ways to say, what do we do? Do we change our business model and inform everybody, hey, here's a problem, we need to invest in solar energy? They didn't, and others didn't either. What they did is get together and start funding climate denial. You have organizations that really spend nothing else than stopping climate change, getting the consensus attacked. Scientifically speaking, there's almost no other, there are very few other facts that have been as well researched. Between 98% and 100% of climate scientists agree on climate change is happening.
And it's caused by man.
It's man-made climate change, and it's really a problem. For me, coming from Germany, as a European, it's mind-boggling that there is still a debate about this. In Europe, you're on the lunatic fringe, except Britain, if you believe that climate change, man-made climate change is not happening. It doesn't necessarily mean that any of the governments do much about it, but it's really something, scientifically speaking, it is very
It's the conventional wisdom.
It's the absolute conventional wisdom. In science, we usually say, or in social science, 95% confidence interval is when it becomes a scientific fact. We're way, way beyond that. You cannot. Climate change man-made climate change is absolutely a scientific fact. Yes, you have individuals who have.
Well, let's not go down that rabbit hole too far. Let's talk about where it comes from a communications perspective, because this is what astounded me: the amount of money invested by organizations, companies, and others on the one side. This is this war mentality.
Right.
To advance this idea that there could be reasonable skepticism, denial of the approach of or the arrival of climate change and its effects.
So when going back to
looked at this number, these
yes,
numbers.
I'll talk a little bit in a second. I mean, in the 1970s and 80s, climate change and climate science was completely apolitical and not contentious until the oil and gas industry realized that it becomes a problem, and then they started to really put money in it. To put it in perspective, I mean, just to take a year, 2010, the last year when we really have data for how much money were spent on climate denial organizations. To put that in perspective, in the same year, the entire PR agency or the PR industry made $6.5 billion.
Okay, so the full market, $6.5 billion.
Yes.
And 1.2 billion of that 6.5 billion was devoted exclusively to advancing climate denial communications.
Well, the equivalent. You can't say because it wasn't directly, the PR agencies were not hired, but it was organizations that were separate. But they had, from budget-wise, they had about this equivalent of 18.5%, so about a fifth of the entire budget that or revenues that the entire PR industry had was dedicated to one issue only: stop climate change. From being a core issue, making social change. Stop any change on climate change. They spent, as I said, I mean, that means the climate deniers have been able to outspend 1,000-fold any public interest or social good organizations to really say this is a problem we have to really.
So this is truly David and Goliath.
Absolutely. So I would say I was not aware how bad it is. I had always a sense this is an issue, but until I started to get into strategic climate change communications and looked at some of the data, I hadn't realized that it really, in 2010, it was, as I said, almost a fifth of the entire equivalent of the agency world, just dedicated to one thing. And if you look at the general data of over longer time period, the study that used that, it was about 11% overall. So,
but suffice to say, over $1 billion devoted to climate denial
per year.
Per year, which is almost certainly, as you said, 1,000-fold or massively, exponentially greater than the investments that are occurring in our sectors, the foundations and nonprofits who may be investing in communications to try to push climate change onto the national stage as a political agenda item.
I have to correct in that overall speaking, it was 900 million if you take the average. But towards the end, 2009 and so, it was over $1 billion each year.
In 2010, but so we don't have any data looking into the last 8 years or so. Okay, last 9 years. Another question. No, nothing. All right, let's keep going. So what does that tell you as a trend? My takeaway from that would be, wow, if we want to continue this war analogy, we are outgunned.
Oh, every day. Outfinanced, outgunned. But also, and that's where my work really focuses on, it's not just the money, it's also often the communication skill set. Because public relations has been training people in public relations since 1947. Boston University started the first PR program in 1947. So they have 70 years. We just started the first public interest communication classes, both at the University of Florida and at West Virginia University. Those are the first really classes, especially on the master's level, where people can study public interest communications. That means they have a 70-year head start. Some of the people that really work in this field have at least the same, if not better, skill set than in the agency world. But if you, on average, most people who go in this field don't have the same professional training as professionally trained advocates on the other side. So, and I think that's where most of the change needs to be happening in the future. I think one of the things, what I envision is that in the future, students would have the choice to either go on the corporate side or really study communications in order to have an impact on society. And we are at a generational shift. The last generation, the millennials and Generation Z, really are a lot more conscious about their power to make social change, and they want to change. And I think that's something that has the potential to really build the field and build a network and overall just generation of professionally trained communicators for the public good.
That makes me think that you're feeling pretty optimistic looking forward, notwithstanding some of the structural challenges, whether that's a lack of investment in the foundation and nonprofit world and communications, whether it's the massive investments on the corporate side, but you see a generational shift coming that you think could be transformational.
No, that's fine. I would agree it could, but it's not necessarily the case. I think we have to embrace this and really give them the chance. And right now, it's still, our field is pretty small. Both on the foundation side overall, but also on the smaller ground, and on the academic training, it is really, we're still doing baby steps in some ways.
And so what opportunities does that mean? Because I think one of the things that's really powerful about working in this field is that if it is still, if not quite in its infancy, and the network may be 40 years old,
right,
we don't look like we're middle-aged. This is a field that's still very much learning and growing and has an opportunity to make massive leaps forward, which means there's a tremendous amount of agency and opportunity for folks who are tuned in, who are doing this work right now. What would your advice be to them? What would your ask be of them for folks who are waking up every day and going into the office and trying to make the world a better place using their skills and using communications for good?
I think I would broaden their mind and start learning a little bit more from the corporate side. PR has built up a real great skill set, very few people are really aware of what of the skill set available and knowledge that is in the PR industry, for example. Same is true about social marketing. Has been developing a theory of how to use marketing for social change, but very few people know about it and very few people use it. I think we need to really get a much closer tie between the academy and the practitioner side. Both sides